Thanks very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I do not have any slides, so I will be reading my text to make sure that I stay within the 15 minutes, otherwise I'm sure I would go on longer. And the question I'm posing is Canada's exceptionalism waning? Immigration policy in Canada has always been contentious over our history, with governments generally developing immigration policy in response to citizens' positive or negative views, and less frequently to lead despite citizens' views. Policies, as you've seen, are changing around the world to assert nationalistic tendencies, and Canada has often been referred to as exceptional with regard to its immigration and refugee policies. The question is, what has caused that exceptionalism, and is Canada inoculated adequately to withstand the pressures to adopt policies more similar to other nations? Are cracks developing that should cause us to be less complacent about the continuation of Canada's exceptionalism? Michael Trebilco from U of T has put forward 5 factors to explain the exceptionalism of contemporary Canadian immigration policy relative to other countries and to our own history. Geography, economic necessity, the changing international geopolitical environment, the structure of the Canadian political system, and political leadership. I'd like to go through each of these and identify potential fault lines. Number 1, geography. Bordering on 3 oceans in the United States has meant that Canada has rarely had to confront significant influxes of unselected, irregular, or illegal migrants. This has resulted in a relatively small number of undocumented people in Canada compared to other countries, and in a general sense that Canada is in control, both in terms of its borders and who is selected to settle in Canada, whether in the economic, family, or refugee classes. This has led to general comfort by Canadians with our current immigration policies. However, despite the relatively few people currently crossing our borders irregularly from the US, some politicians are exploiting the fears of Canadians that we are, quote, losing control of our borders, close quote. Craig will speak more to this point a little bit later in the panel. Relative to other countries, Canada receives a modest number of asylum seekers making claims at our ports of entry or inland. However, these numbers are increasing, along with processing backlogs and gaining both political and media attention. Number 2, economic necessity. Canada's declining birth rate, increased dependency ratio, aging population, and growing skill and labor shortages have all contributed to Canadians' acceptance of immigration as one important tool to address these issues. However, in more difficult economic times, when jobs become more precarious and people become more concerned about the impact of increased digitization, robotics, artificial intelligence, will economic concerns result in less support for immigration? Number 3, the changing international geopolitical environment. Post-World War II Canada played an important middle power role in the emergence of a global human rights regime, the United Nations, and other international bodies. It was therefore very vulnerable to criticisms of hypocrisy if it maintained discriminatory immigration policies, which we had, counter to the principles Canada was promoting internationally. This led to much more expansive and open immigration policies in the 1960s. However, at a time when there is less support for international organizations, less enforcement of multilateral agreements, power imbalances shifting away from the liberal world order, and former countries of immigration erecting both literal and metaphorical walls at their borders, how important will Canada see its future global role? Number 4, the structure of the Canadian legislative and political system. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act is framework legislation which leaves much of the detail of policy to regulations which do not have to be approved by Parliament. This allows for changes in policy to be made fairly easily by the government of the day. The previous administration went even further by amending the legislation to allow the Minister of Immigration to make major changes to policy merely by instructions to officials. This provides an easy way to implement politically directed changes to policy. However, the Canadian electoral system at the federal level has pushed all the major political parties in the past into centrist positions regarding immigration policy, particularly because the first-past-the-post system requires any political party with national aspirations to adopt policies that appeal to immigrant voters in key ridings in the suburbs of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And representation of naturalized citizens in the federal parliament is higher than in any other national legislature in the world. These two factors have prevented the adoption of overtly anti-immigration policies. But if federal electoral reform is introduced in Canada, a proportional representation system could encourage the rise of small extremist parties, including a nationalist anti-immigration party, which could win seats and a platform in the parliament, and potentially a role in coalition governments, which could affect immigration policy. There is also the role of federalism to consider. Immigration is a shared jurisdiction between the federal and provincial governments, and the provinces are playing a significantly greater role in the selection of economic immigrants across the country. Such decentralization of authority has maintained a broad consensus in favor of prevailing immigration policies. Mireille will speak to the situation in Quebec in particular. And number 5, political leadership. There is no question about the importance of political leadership and discourse in the area of immigration policy. Some analysts credit the leadership role played by Pierre Elliott Trudeau to transform Canada's fundamental identity from a binary nation to a multicultural one, through the establishment of a multiculturalism policy and the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, both of which were hotly contested at the time. Contrary to other countries, Canada's version of multiculturalism was stated by Trudeau in 1971 as the very essence of Canadian identity, and stressed the importance of a proactive role by the government in promoting the integration of immigrants from diverse backgrounds into the mainstream of Canadian life. Since that time, subsequent prime ministers of both political stripes have tended to support immigration to Canada. It was the Conservative government in 1979 that opened our doors to 60,000 refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, for example. We saw the discourse on immigration change under the previous administration, with, for example, refugee claimants being called phony queue jumpers, taking advantage of Canada's generous policies. Immigration and refugee and citizenship policies were changed significantly during the Harper regime, becoming much more restrictive. I can't see my time. Okay. Refugee policy became a key election issue during the campaign of 2015. Media coverage about the Syrian refugee crisis and the death of Alan Kurdi led to political parties vying with each other about which would bring in more refugees in the shortest time frame. The Conservative Party's slow, reluctant, and modest response to the crisis, along with its proposed snitch line on barbaric cultural practices, contributed to their defeat. The Liberals' sunny ways prevailed, and Trudeau fils took on his father's mantle and commitment to immigration, multiculturalism, and diversity. So where is government policy now, less than a year away from the next election? The Liberal government has eliminated many of the previous administration's restrictive changes to the Citizenship Act and the family class, has made it easier for international students and highly skilled temporary foreign workers to transition to permanent residency, and has committed to a 3-year plan of incrementally increased levels of immigration to a total of 350,000 by 2021, with modest increases to the family class and to the pre-Syrian refugee admission levels. However, despite an increase to the budget of the IRB, it is still woefully under-resourced to deal with the ever-growing backlog of refugee claims, and there has been no attempt to deal seriously with the Safe Third Country Agreement, which Craig will deal with. The Conservative Party is hammering the government on the irregular border crossers, and Maxime Bernier's People's Party is denouncing extreme multiculturalism. It would require immigrants to adopt so-called Canadian values and would reduce immigration levels down to 250,000. Minister Hussein has launched a pro-immigration campaign and is touring the country to talk about the benefits of immigration. The Conservative and People's parties seem intent to making immigration an issue in the next election. And where are the Canadian people now, less than a year away from the next election? My colleague at Queen's, Keith Banting, has written that a combination of economic and cultural insecurity has led to the rise of anti-immigrant populism in other countries. In Canada, his research shows that although there is growing sense of economic insecurity in Canada, Canadians do not attribute this to immigration, and approximately 80% see immigration as having a positive impact on the economy. However, there is a growing sense of cultural insecurity in his research among Canadians, with just over half saying that immigrants do not adapt or integrate as well as they should, and approximately a third being uncomfortable with the new Canada. This is potential fuel for mobilization by political parties. Angus Reid and Environics opinion surveys conducted in August and October of this year had similar findings. Environics compared results of surveys taken in February 2018 and October 2018 and found that while Canadians are still more likely to be positive about immigration than not, opinions have hardened a bit in terms of overall levels of immigration. However, the most sensitive issue for many Canadians, according to this survey, is how immigrants integrate or fit into the country once they arrive. 52% of Canadians agree that too many immigrants do not adopt Canadian values, up from 50% in February. However, despite this uptick, these numbers are lower than for the most of the past 25 years. In terms of refugee claimants, 41% agreed in the most recent poll that most people claiming to be refugees are not real refugees, up 2 points since February. It's important to note that when the responses are disaggregated, however, by different population groups, there are vast differences in opinion by age, education level, region of the country, and most importantly, by who they vote for. Younger, the more educated, residents of BC and Liberal and NDP voters are the most positive about immigration, while older Canadians, those with the least education, residents in Alberta, and Conservative and People's Party supporters are the most negative. Interestingly enough, when asked to identify the most important problem facing Canada today in an open-ended question, immigration and refugee issues remain well down the list, with only 5% of those people supporting the three major political parties spontaneously identifying this issue, but 19% of those who say they will vote for the People's Party identifying immigration and refugee issues as Canada's top problem. Angus Reid's survey found a notable increase in the percentage of people saying there should be fewer immigrants to Canada. As immigration targets rose from 260,000 to 310,000 between 2014 and 2018, the percentage of people agreeing that immigration levels should decrease rose from 36% in 2014 to 49% in 2018. Like the Environics data, responses varied based on education level and political party, with more support for higher immigration from those with more education and voters for Liberal and NDP parties. These surveys indicate the increasingly divergent views of supporters of different political parties. It will be interesting to see how the parties position themselves for the upcoming election and how they will balance the needs, interests, and concerns of various population groups across the country, including first and second generation immigrants, without alienating others. Canada is facing many of the issues that led to anti-immigration policies in other countries, albeit to a much lesser degree, given the factors identified earlier. We have been fortunate so far, but continued vigilance, good public policy and strong political leadership are absolutely essential. We are not immune as a country, and our exceptionalism cannot be guaranteed without regular inoculation. Thank you.